You know, right in the heart of America's whiskey country, there's a pretty wild crisis brewing. But this isn't some story about a total collapse. Nope, this is about a really sophisticated strategy to turn a massive surplus into what could be a generational opportunity. Let's dive in.
So it all kicks off with this number, 16.1 million. That is how many barrels of bourbon are sitting in Kentucky warehouses right now. It is the most we've seen since Prohibition. I mean, that is just a staggering amount of whiskey.
And that leads you to a classic question, right? What happens when you have way too much of a really good thing? You might think, oh, the prices will just crash for everybody, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that.
Because, you see, in Kentucky, this situation doesn't just create a headache for the distilleries, it actually creates a historic opportunity for savvy investors. It's a chance to profit from something called arbitrage, basically exploiting the price difference between two markets for the exact same thing.
All right, so how on earth did the bourbon industry end up practically drowning in its own success? Well, to really get the opportunity here, you first have to understand the bubble itself.
So the heart of the problem is this classic supply chain issue called the bullwhip effect. Think back to the pandemic. We were all stuck at home, and a lot of us started drinking more premium spirits. Distillers saw that spike, they thought it was the new normal, and they just cranked production way up. But then, of course, our habits changed again, and now they're left with warehouses full of bourbon that was basically distilled for a party that's already over.
And here's the fallout. I mean, just look at this table. It tells the whole story. The dramatic shift from the 2020 peak to right now. The barrel inventory nearly doubled. The industry's total tax bill has absolutely exploded from around $28 to $75 million. And, crucially, the whole dynamic has flipped. It went from a seller's market where they couldn't make it fast enough to a buyer's market.
But look, that oversupply, that's only half the story. The real kicker, the thing that's actually forcing distilleries to sell off their inventory at a discount, is a ticking tax clock that is totally unique to Kentucky.
Yeah, here's the crazy part of Kentucky law. It is the only place on the entire planet that charges an annual property tax on every single barrel of whiskey while it's aging. Can you imagine that? Your inventory gets taxed every single year before you can even sell it. And that tax bill is just spiraling out of control. Over just the last 5 years, the total tax liability for these distillers has shot up by a jaw-dropping 163%. That is some serious financial pressure. This quote just nails the problem perfectly. The distilleries are asset-rich. I mean, they're sitting on literally millions of dollars worth of whiskey, but they're cash poor. They don't have the actual cash on hand to pay this massive immediate tax bill, and that forces them to sell inventory, often at a really steep discount. So, all this forced selling in the US creates the perfect buy low scenario. This is where that arbitrage opportunity really comes into focus. And now for the sell high part of the plan, well, that takes us about halfway around the world. Okay, here's the whole strategy in a nutshell. On one side of the world, in the US, the wholesale market is flooded and prices are dropping. But on the other side, in key Asian markets, you've got incredibly high demand, premium prices, and consumers who see American whiskey as a luxury status symbol. The strategy couldn't be simpler. Buy barrels on the left and sell bottles on the right. So this all sounds great in theory, but how would an investor actually pull this off? Well, this is where a very specific asset-light private equity model comes into play. An asset-light just means the fund doesn't need to own the actual distilleries or bottling plants, just the barrels, which is the most valuable part anyway. And it's a pretty clear four-step process. First, you form a fund, a legal entity to pool all the capital together. Second, you raise that capital legally, often using SEC rules like Regulation D, which lets you fundraise from professional investors without a big public offering. Third, and this is the key, you use that cash to swoop in and buy barrels from these distressed distilleries at a discount. And finally, step 4, you rebrand that bourbon and export it for a nice profit. And listen, this isn't just some abstract idea. The strategy is looking at real specific targets. We're talking about things like court-ordered bankruptcy auctions for distilleries that have been forced to liquidate all their barrels. These are the absolute prime sources for getting your hands on that super discounted whiskey. All right, so you've acquired the barrels for cheap. Now the final phase begins, getting that delicious bourbon into the hands of very eager consumers. Let's take a look at where all that demand is, and more importantly, why? The export plan is super focused. That big slice you see, 40% of the effort, is aimed squarely at South Korea. That's the high-growth engine.
Another 30% is for China, which is all about volume, even though it comes with some risk. And then 20% is for Japan, which is a really stable, mature market.
South Korea is the absolute star of this whole strategy. Seriously, the market for American whiskey there is exploding. We're talking over 40% growth annually. It's being driven by a huge highball cocktail culture, especially among younger drinkers who are moving away from more traditional spirits.
Now, China. China represents the biggest prize, but is also, by far, the biggest gamble. The potential volume you could sell there is just enormous, but the threat of retaliatory trade tariffs could slap a 25% or even higher tax on the product overnight, completely wiping out your profit margins. It's a classic high-risk, high-reward situation.
And, that really brings us to the big picture. This strategy, as brilliant as it sounds on paper, is definitely not a walk in the park. It comes with some pretty significant challenges.
For this to work, you've got to overcome some serious hurdles. There's the geopolitical risk of a trade war, the logistical nightmare of America's bizarre three-tier system for alcohol distribution, making sure you're not buying low-quality whiskey in a glut, and navigating an absolute mountain of international regulations. It really requires some serious expertise.
So when you boil it all down, Kentucky's bourbon bubble is just a fascinating case study. It shows how a regional crisis, driven by overproduction and a really quirky tax law, can create a massive global arbitrage opportunity. It's a great reminder that every single glut creates an opening, which leaves us with one last thought. What's going to be the next bourbon?